Have you ever been judged solely by your appearance? Jonathan Lewis, a humble black man in his 70s, wanted nothing more than a peaceful flight to visit his son. Instead, he faced acts of discrimination and disrespect from a flight attendant and even the flight's co-pilot. The situation escalated when he was threatened with a permanent flight ban. But then the truth was revealed. He was the father of the airline's chairman. What happened next? A compassionate resolution left the entire cabin silent, imparting a powerful and unforgettable lesson for everyone. What do you think about the way Jonathan maintained his calm and showed forgiveness? Have you ever faced similar injustices? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Now, let's dive into this meaningful story together. The loudspeaker announcements echoed across the bustling waiting area of Atlanta Airport, where a constant stream of people moved like flowing currents. Passengers, having just cleared security, pulled their suitcases behind them, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions. Some hurried, others excited, and a few tinged with worry. The day was chilly, with winter winds slipping through the automatic doors, prompting everyone to board quickly and seek the warmth of the cabin. Amidst the crowd, an elderly black man with snow-white hair walked slowly toward the boarding gate. He wore a thick, well-worn coat, and his calm demeanor, coupled with the depth of experience in his eyes, drew subtle attention. This was Jonathan Lewis, a man in his 70s, making his way to New York to visit his son and family for the new year. Jonathan was no ordinary man. He was the father of Matthew Lewis, the chairman and founder of Eagle Wings Airlines, one of the largest airlines in the United States. But unless introduced, no one would have guessed his connection. Jonathan embraced a lifestyle of simplicity and humility. He disliked boasting or using his son's position to seek special privileges. He firmly believed a person is defined by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Today, Jonathan had chosen a seat in the economy class on flight EW 1847, instead of the first-class seat or private jet his son frequently arranged for him. He wanted to experience the flight as any other passenger would, ordinary, simple, and unpretentious. Settling into his seat in the waiting area, Jonathan opened an old leather-bound book, carefully turning its pages. The book had accompanied him on countless journeys, its words etched into his life's story. As he thought about the upcoming reunion with his son and grandchildren, a gentle smile graced his kind face. As Jonathan savored his moment of peace, a young flight attendant strode confidently down the aisle nearby. Her name was Heather Coleman, a familiar figure among the crew of Eagle Wings Airlines. Heather was known for her striking appearance and professional demeanor, but her colleagues often complained about her arrogance and, at times, her unabashedly discriminatory attitude. Heather caught a glimpse of Jonathan as he approached the boarding area. His modest clothing and well-worn suitcase seemed to grab her attention, though not in a positive way. Her eyes briefly flashed with disdain, and her lips curved into a faint, inscrutable smirk. Jonathan didn't notice. Bowing his head slightly, he made his way calmly to the plane's entrance, where Heather and another flight attendant were stationed to greet passengers. Heather barely acknowledged him, offering only a perfunctory nod as he passed. Yet, her eyes followed him with a coldness that others nearby could sense. Jonathan found his seat, 22A, by the window. He stood to stow his suitcase in the overhead compartment. His hands trembled slightly with age, but he managed on his own, unwilling to inconvenience anyone. Heather, standing nearby, noticed his effort but made no move to assist. Instead, she stepped closer, her tone icy as she said, "Are you sure your bag isn't too heavy? We don't want to damage the overhead bins with oversized luggage." Jonathan looked up, his eyes calm and composed. "Thank you, young lady, but my bag is within the regulations." "I assure you of that," he replied. Heather curled her lips in a slight sneer but said nothing more. She turned to leave, but not before casting another deliberate glance at Jonathan, as if to make sure he understood her lack of regard. A few nearby passengers noticed her demeanor, but no one spoke up. Settling into his seat, Jonathan placed his book on the tray table in front of him. He exhaled softly, then offered a gentle smile. To him, this was merely a minor inconvenience, hardly worth his attention. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a series of actions Heather was about to direct toward him deliberately. Jonathan settled into seat 22A by the window, his gentle eyes gazing out at the vast Atlanta sky stretching endlessly toward the horizon. He cherished moments like these, quiet, reflective pauses amidst the expanse of the world outside. Yet his peace would not last long. In the main aisle, Heather Coleman began her pre-flight checks. Among the crew, she was known for her efficiency and quick thinking, but today Heather wasn't extending her professionalism to everyone. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward Jonathan, and her expression carried an unmistakable coldness that was hard to ignore. When the plane took off and reached cruising altitude, Heather began pushing the cart with beverages and light snacks down the aisle. The low murmur of passengers chatting filled the cabin, but Heather's focus seemed to center on a single person, Jonathan. When the cart reached his row, Heather passed by Jonathan as if she didn't see him sitting there. The passengers near him exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what was happening. Jonathan, maintaining his usual calm demeanor, gently raised his head and asked, "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water, please?" Heather stopped, but not out of a desire to serve him. She turned her head, her eyes flashing with visible annoyance. "We haven't gotten to your row yet," she snapped. "Please wait your turn." Jonathan offered a soft smile. "That's all right. I'll wait," he replied. However, the passengers nearby began to feel uncomfortable. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell, sitting just 2 seats away, frowned and whispered to her travel companion, "What's her problem? That attitude is completely unacceptable." Sarah kept her eyes on Heather as she moved through the other rows, but even on her return trip, Heather deliberately ignored Jonathan. A few minutes later, Heather finally returned to his row, this time holding a glass of water. Instead of placing it gently on the tray table, she slammed it down with a loud thud, causing Sarah and several other passengers to turn their heads. Drops of water splashed out of the glass, soaking Jonathan's sleeve. "Be careful next time," Heather said, her tone devoid of any sincerity. She shot Jonathan a cold look before walking away, as if she had just done him a monumental favor. Jonathan remained composed, calmly dabbing his sleeve with a tissue. He looked up and watched Heather walk away, a faint smile on his face. "Thank you, very thoughtful of you," he said, his voice warm and steady. Sarah could no longer stay silent. She turned to Jonathan with a look of genuine concern and asked, "Are you all right? I think she's being completely unreasonable." Jonathan nodded, his gentle smile unwavering. "Thank you, young lady. I'm fine. It's just a small matter, not worth making a fuss over." But his words did little to ease Sarah's frustration. She turned to a middle-aged man sitting nearby, Tom Harris, a businessman on his way to New York for a meeting with clients. "He seems used to being treated this way," Sarah whispered, her voice laced with indignation. "But we can't just let her get away with it." Tom nodded in agreement, though he remained quiet, clearly deliberating how to step in without escalating the situation further. Heather, however, wasn't finished. When serving snacks later, she returned to Jonathan's row with a tray of food. She slammed it down on his tray table, the loud thud catching the attention of nearby passengers. But that wasn't all. Heather tilted the tray slightly as she set it down, causing some of the food to spill onto Jonathan's lap. Crumbs scattered across his pants. "Oh, my apologies," Heather said, her tone dripping with insincerity. "Perhaps you should be more careful when receiving your food." Jonathan looked down at his lap, then up at Heather, his expression calm yet difficult to read. Bending forward, he carefully picked up the crumbs and placed them to the side. "It's all right, young lady. I'll be more careful next time," he said, his voice low and composed. This time, the other passengers couldn't stay quiet. Sarah shot to her feet, her eyes blazing with anger. "What is your problem with him?" Sarah's voice rang through the cabin. "This isn't the first time you've acted like this. Your behavior is completely unacceptable." Heather turned to face Sarah, her eyes sharp and defiant. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. If you're unhappy with my service, feel free to file a complaint with the airline after the flight," she replied, her tone unapologetically confrontational. Tom joined in, his voice firm and steady. "No, you're not doing your job. You're making a passenger feel disrespected. This is not how a flight attendant should behave." Tom's words drew nods of agreement from several passengers nearby. An elderly woman sitting a few rows back called out, "We've all seen it. This flight attendant is completely in the wrong." Heather, noticing the growing dissatisfaction among the passengers, refrained from saying anything more. She cast a sharp glare at both Sarah and Tom before turning on her heel and walking away. Yet, her actions had left a palpable tension hanging in the air. Jonathan bowed his head slightly and offered Sarah and Tom a faint smile. "Thank you both for your concern, but please, don't let this bother you." Despite Jonathan's calm demeanor, the anger and frustration among the passengers only grew. The story, it seemed, was far from over. The atmosphere in the cabin grew stifling following the heated exchange between Heather and the passengers. Disapproving glances were cast toward the young flight attendant, who maintained her haughty demeanor despite the mounting complaints and opposition. Heather, sensing that the situation was slipping out of her control, decided to play her power card. Her uncle, Philip Coleman, the flight's co-pilot. Heather strode briskly toward the cockpit, the sharp clicks of her high heels on the floor matching the rigid determination in her attitude. Reaching the cockpit door, she knocked lightly and then opened it without waiting for a response. Inside, Philip Coleman, a man in his early 50s with a stern face, was seated, intently monitoring the control instruments. "Uncle Philip," Heather began, lowering her voice, though her frustration was still evident. "We have an issue in economy. There's a passenger causing a commotion and making it impossible for me to do my job. I need your help." Philip turned to face her, his eyebrows furrowing into a straight line. "Which passenger?" he asked, his deep voice tinged with skepticism, as if doubting that something so minor warranted his intervention. Heather wasted no time responding. "It's an old man in seat 22A. He's been causing problems and making unreasonable demands. I've tried to handle it, but he's only made things worse, and now some of the other passengers are starting to side with him." Philip exhaled a heavy sigh but nodded. As the flight's co-pilot, he felt obligated to step in and resolve the issue before it escalated further. Heather followed closely behind him, her eyes glinting with satisfaction, confident that the situation was about to turn in her favor. Philip entered the cabin, his authoritative presence causing a few passengers to pause their conversations. He stopped in front of Jonathan, his gaze briefly sweeping over the elderly man before turning to Heather, as if to confirm his target. "What's going on here?" Philip demanded, his tone firm and brimming with authority. Heather quickly stepped in, her voice tinged with feigned frustration. "Uncle, he's been causing trouble throughout the flight. Not only has he made things difficult for me, but he's also disrupted the other passengers. I've tried to handle it, but he's simply not cooperating." Jonathan lifted his head, his calm eyes meeting Philip's cold, scrutinizing stare. He didn't rush to speak, his silence a quiet but powerful form of resistance that unsettled Philip. Before Philip could say anything further, Sarah Mitchell stood abruptly, her voice brimming with indignation. "That's not true. It's Heather who's been causing trouble. She's been rude and disrespectful to him since the very beginning of the flight. We've all seen it." Philip turned to Sarah, his expression momentarily surprised but quickly regaining its sternness. "Ma'am, could you calm down? If he's been disrespected, why are all of you making such a fuss about it?" Tom Harris, the middle-aged businessman seated near Jonathan, spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "We're not making a fuss. It's your niece's behavior toward this gentleman that's made it impossible for us to stay silent. She hasn't just been disrespectful, she's deliberately made things worse." Philip narrowed his eyes, but instead of addressing their concerns, he turned back to Jonathan, his tone growing colder. "Sir, do you have anything to say? If you've truly been causing disruptions, as Heather claims, I'll have no choice but to report this to the airline's management after we land. And if necessary, we may have to impose a permanent flight ban against you." Philip's words cut through the already tense atmosphere like a cold blade. A few passengers nearby froze, stunned that a flight crew member would make such a threat against an elderly and respectful passenger like Jonathan. In stark contrast to the shock of others, Jonathan remained composed as always. He looked at Philip, his eyes exuding a rare and calm strength. After a brief silence, he spoke softly. "I don't believe I've done anything to warrant being banned from flying, but if you feel that's necessary, I will accept it." Jonathan's gentle words carried a strange, quiet power that made Philip hesitate and step back slightly. But before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. No one has the right to threaten him like that. If you think you can use your authority to bully someone, you're gravely mistaken. Sarah turned to the other passengers, her voice rising with conviction. You've all seen what's happened, haven't you? We can't let this continue. They're treating him unfairly. Passengers around her began to voice their agreement. An elderly woman from a few rows back called out, "We've all seen it. The way Heather has treated him is absolutely unacceptable." A young man sitting in the middle rows raised his phone, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. I've recorded part of this incident. If you keep this up, I'll post the video on social media. Let's see how your airline explains this. Philip, a man who prided himself on his ability to handle tense situations, now felt cornered. The growing outrage in the cabin made it clear that authority alone wouldn't resolve this issue. Heather, standing beside him, had turned pale. She hadn't anticipated that her arrogance would spark such a storm. Still, even in this moment, she tried to defend herself. "Uncle Philip, they're blowing this out of proportion. I was just trying to do my job." But Philip's patience had worn thin. He turned to Heather, his voice low but brimming with tension. "That's enough, Heather. Be quiet." Before Philip could act further, a deep, commanding voice rang out from the back of the cabin. "Co-pilot Coleman, I believe it's time for me to step in." Everyone turned to see Captain James Walters, his authoritative presence unmistakable, as he strode purposefully toward the center of the cabin. Captain James Walters' steady footsteps echoed rhythmically as he walked toward the center of the cabin. His sharp gaze swept across the faces around him, from the tense passengers to Heather's stiff and defensive demeanor, and finally to co-pilot Philip, who stood in front of Jonathan with an air of authority. The heavy atmosphere shifted into complete silence, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for James to deliver clarity to the chaotic situation. James stopped in front of Philip, tilting his head slightly in a brief but serious acknowledgement. His voice, deep and firm, carried the weight of a leader in command. "Co-pilot Coleman, I've received reports about a tense situation here. I believe it's time we address this professionally." Philip, despite his years of experience, felt the pressure in James's voice. He glanced toward Heather, as though seeking support, but Heather kept her head down, avoiding the gaze of both her uncle and the captain. "Captain, this is just a misunderstanding," Philip began, but James raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "I want to hear from both sides," James said decisively. "And more importantly, I want to hear from the passengers, those who witnessed the incident firsthand." Turning to Linda, the senior flight attendant, James gave her a pointed look. "Linda, please explain what you've observed." Linda stepped forward, her voice soft but steady and clear. "Captain, the passenger in seat 22A, Mr. Jonathan, has been repeatedly denied service and treated disrespectfully by Heather. I noticed the situation escalating when several passengers stood up to defend him, and that's when Heather called co-pilot Coleman to intervene. However, from what I observed, I believe Heather's actions are the primary cause of the unrest in the cabin." James nodded, his sharp eyes shifting to Heather. "Heather, do you have anything to say to explain yourself?" Heather, now visibly pale, struggled to maintain her composure. "Captain, he's been making constant demands and giving me a hard time. I've been trying to handle it, but the other passengers blew the situation out of proportion, and that's why it spiraled out of control." "Constant demands?" James repeated, his brow furrowing. "Can you specify what he requested that exceeded the rights of an economy-class passenger?" Heather didn't respond immediately. She stammered for a few seconds, her eyes darting toward Philip as if seeking backup. But this time, Philip remained silent, seemingly aware that the situation had shifted entirely out of his and Heather's favor. Sarah Mitchell, who had stood up for Jonathan from the very beginning, stepped forward again, her voice filled with indignation. "He hasn't caused any trouble at all. It's Heather who's deliberately targeting him. From the very start of this flight, she refused to serve him, made sarcastic remarks, and even spilled water on his sleeve. We all saw it." Tom Harris chimed in, his voice steady but firm. "She intentionally used her rude behavior to belittle him, And when we spoke up, she called the co-pilot to threaten all of us, saying we'd be banned from flying if we didn't stay quiet. An elderly woman from a few rows back raised her hand, her voice trembling with emotion. I've flown many times, but this is the first time I've ever seen an elderly passenger treated so poorly. If the airline doesn't address this, I won't be flying with them again. Those words added fuel to the fire. Several other passengers voiced their agreement, and some even raised their phones, announcing they had recorded parts of the incident and would post it on social media. Amid the growing chaos, James turned to Jonathan, who had remained silently composed. His eyes showed no trace of anger, only a faint sadness. Sir, James began, his voice calm but filled with respect. I'm truly sorry for what you've experienced. If you don't mind, I'd like to hear more from your perspective. Jonathan lifted his head, his kind eyes meeting James with steady resolve. A gentle smile graced his face as he spoke, his voice deep and soothing. Thank you, young man, but I think the passengers around me have said enough. I don't want to see this escalate any further. In that moment, James froze. The calm demeanor, the warm and measured voice, it all felt familiar. He had met this man before at an internal company event. This was Jonathan Lewis, the father of Matthew Lewis, the founder and chairman of Eagle Wings Airlines. James took a deep breath, his eyes flashing with recognition and a hint of shock. But within seconds, his expression hardened with determination. It was time to act decisively. James turned to Philip and Heather, his voice turning icy. I think the two of you should know that Mr. Jonathan Lewis is not just an ordinary passenger. He is the father of Matthew Lewis, the chairman of the airline you are serving. His words landed like a bombshell in the cabin. Heather staggered back a step, her face turning as pale as a sheet, unable to say a word. Philip, who had always maintained a stern and composed demeanor, now struggled to conceal his visible discomfort. But James wasn't finished. He fixed Heather with a sharp, piercing gaze, his tone cutting like a blade. Even if he weren't the chairman's father, your actions would still be completely unacceptable. Every passenger, no matter who they are, deserves respect, and it's clear that you have failed to show that. James demanded that Heather apologize to Jonathan immediately in front of the entire cabin. Heather opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but before she could utter a word, Jonathan raised his hand, gently interrupting her. There's no need to apologize to me, he said, his voice calm, yet laden with weight. Remember this. Respect is not a privilege you grant to someone. It's something you owe to everyone because it reflects your own dignity. His words left not only Heather, but the entire cabin in stunned silence. Many passengers nodded in agreement, and some were even moved to tears by the profound simplicity of his statement. Heather stood frozen, her face as pale as a sheet. James's words echoed in her mind. He is the father of the chairman of the airline you are serving. She took a step back, her legs feeling weak beneath her. The eyes of the surrounding passengers bore into her, no longer just filled with indignation, but now laden with heavy judgment. Philip, despite his extensive experience in the airline industry, could not hide his discomfort. Clearing his throat, he attempted to regain his authority. James, I think we should handle this internally. There's no need to make a big deal out of it here. But James wasn't going to let him off the hook. Turning to Philip, his gaze was icy, his words unyielding. Co-pilot Coleman, I respect you as a colleague, but using your authority to shield a family member without objectively assessing the situation is a serious error. I will be reporting this entire incident to upper management. James's statement left Philip visibly pale, and the cabin fell into a hushed silence. Slowly, a few passengers began to clap. The scattered applause quickly grew into a unified ovation, a powerful show of support for James and his decisive actions. Jonathan, who had remained silent while observing everything, slowly stood up. He looked at James with a grateful expression before turning to Philip and Heather. His voice was warm and steady, devoid of any anger. James, thank you for handling this fairly, but I don't want this to become overly serious. We all make mistakes, and what's important is that we learn from them. I'm not asking for severe punishment for either of them. Heather looked up, her eyes red and brimming with tears. She couldn't believe that the man she had deliberately disrespected could speak with such kindness. Jonathan continued, but I want everyone to remember this. Respect should never depend on someone's appearance or position. It is the most fundamental and important thing in how we treat one another. Jonathan's words left the cabin in silence. A few passengers nodded in agreement, and some even shed tears, deeply moved by his wisdom. Sarah leaned toward Tom and whispered, "He's incredible. Not everyone could say something like that after everything that's happened." Heather lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I'm truly sorry. I was wrong. So wrong. I don't deserve your forgiveness." Jonathan looked at her, his gaze gentle, like a father speaking to his child. "Young lady, we all make mistakes. What matters is what you learn from them. I forgive you, but remember, forgiveness isn't meant to let you forget your mistakes. It's meant to help you change." Heather couldn't respond, overcome with emotion. She turned to James as if awaiting his final judgment. James nodded, his voice firm, but not devoid of compassion. "Heather, you will undergo retraining on how to serve and treat passengers with respect. I will ensure you fully understand your responsibilities before you are allowed to continue working. And remember, this is your final chance." Heather nodded, tears still flowing down her cheeks. But this time, they were tears of genuine remorse. As the plane landed, Jonathan stepped onto the tarmac, his demeanor calm yet exuding an air of quiet dignity. A private car awaited to take him to meet his son, but he paused, turning to James and Heather. "Captain James," he said with a gentle smile, "you're a good leader. Never forget that how we treat others defines who we are." James bowed his head, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I'll remember your words." Heather bowed deeply, unable to lift her gaze until Jonathan had walked away. In the airport lounge, Jonathan reunited with Matthew, his son. The two embraced tightly, and Matthew hide his emotions as he listened to Jonathan recount the entire story. "This will never happen again, Father," Matthew said. "We'll ensure improvements, not just in procedure, but in the culture of this airline." Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder and smiled. "Do it not just for me, son, but for everyone. That's what truly matters." Life isn't always easy, and sometimes how we treat others in the smallest moments reflects the truest measure of our character. Jonathan Lewis didn't just teach Heather and Philip a valuable lesson. He showed us all that respect isn't a luxury reserved for a select few, but a basic right everyone deserves. On that flight, his compassion, forgiveness, and graciousness touched the hearts of everyone present. Remember, in life, even the smallest act of kindness can change an entire story. If you found value in this story, share it to spread this message of humanity and respect. Thank you for watching, and continue to join us in sharing stories of kindness. This is Stories About Kindness. Goodbye, and see you next time.